In 1910, in the quiet town of Amiens, northern France, young Englishman Stephen Wraysford becomes part of the Azer household. He started liking Isabelle Azer, the wife of his host, René Azer. Isabelle had 2 children, and Stephen's role was to observe the factory operations run by René Azer, her husband. Stephen learns that the local textile dyers have gone on strike due to poor wages and harsh working conditions. Although René doesn't employ dyers, his own workers are upset about the potential threat of new technology taking their jobs. Fearing a larger workers' strike, René becomes preoccupied with the situation at the factory, paying little attention to his home life. One day, on his way home, Stephen sees Isabelle alone in the garden. They start talking, and Stephen learns that the 2 children are not her own. She is their stepmother. René's first wife passed away 8 years ago, and Isabelle married him 2 years later. At night, Stephen would sometimes hear Isabelle crying as René beat her, but as a guest in their home, he felt powerless to intervene. Despite this, Stephen becomes increasingly fascinated by Isabelle. After discovering her secretly delivering food to the striking dyers and their families, his feelings deepen and he falls in love with her. Isabelle, in turn, finds herself equally drawn to Stephen. The day finally arrives. As Stephen had predicted, all the workers go on strike, demanding fair wages. René is tense, but he believes that progress can't be achieved if employers keep giving in to every demand. Hearing this, Stephen feels disappointed in René. As he heads back inside, he hears the sound of a piano playing. Curious, he follows the music and approaches, thinking it's Isabelle. He gently pats her shoulder, but when she turns, it's not Isabelle, it's Jeanne, Isabelle's sister. At that moment, Isabelle enters the room and embraces her sister. A few days later, Jeanne leaves, and Isabelle is deeply upset by her sister's departure. When she finds herself alone with Stephen, she expresses how much she misses Jeanne. In a moment of vulnerability, Stephen pulls her close and kisses her, leading to a passionate exchange. Trapped in a loveless marriage with a husband who abuses her, Isabelle is receptive to Stephen's affection, and they soon begin a heated affair. They frequently meet in the Red Room, a forgotten bedroom in the servants' quarters, where their love grows in secret. Their romantic meetings continue, deepening their relationship. One day, while Stephen was sketching, Isabelle's daughter, Lisette, approached him and attempted to seduce him. However, Stephen rejected her advances. Later, he urged Isabelle to leave René. During dinner one evening, René brought up the fact that someone had been delivering food to the families of the striking dyers. Isabelle admitted that she was the one helping them. Already aware of this through his sources, René grew frustrated and asked everyone to leave the room. When Stephen refused, René became enraged, but Isabelle insisted that Stephen stay. This confirmed René's suspicions about their affair. Isabelle apologized but also pointed out the ways René had wronged her. In his frustration, René ordered Stephen to leave the house, but Isabelle declared she would leave with him. In a rush, Isabelle packed her belongings and they fled together. For a while, they lived a quiet life in the small French town of Saint-Rémy. However, Stephen's life took a tragic turn when Isabelle suddenly disappeared without any explanation. Heartbroken, Stephen didn't search for her, hoping she might return on her own. After waiting a year with no sign of her, he moved to Paris. He found work as an assistant to a furniture maker, but his life felt empty and purposeless. When World War I broke out in 1914, Stephen welcomed the distraction and enlisted in the army. His education helped him rise through the ranks, and he soon became a lieutenant fighting on the Western Front in France. The British trenches were filled with death and decay, and each day brought unimaginable horrors. Despite the bleakness, Stephen found solace in his friendship with a fellow soldier, Michael Weir. Now, far removed from Isabelle and the Red Room, Stephen rarely thought of her. His daily struggle for survival consumed him, and as the war raged on, Stephen was fueled by his hatred for the German enemy and the burden of leading men into battle, many of whom would never return. One day, during a bomb blast, one of Stephen's soldiers was gravely injured, his body blown apart, leaving him on the brink of death. Rushing to the soldier's side, Stephen urged him to remember his girlfriend in his final moments, but the soldier died in front of him. Later, Stephen shared a moment with Weir, who confessed that he had never been with a woman. Stephen reassured him that he wouldn't die in the war and would eventually meet a good woman. Witnessing so much death gave Stephen a grim understanding of human anatomy, which he sketched in detail to comprehend it better. Using his artistic skill as a means of processing the horrors around him. While patrolling one night, Stephen found a soldier named Firebrace, a tunneler, asleep on duty. A letter and a photo lay on the ground beside him. Stephen woke him up, frustrated, and reminded him that the German soldiers were just 50 yards away. They were under attack from both below and above ground, yet Firebrace had fallen asleep. Firebrace apologized, but Stephen, disappointed, warned him that sleeping on watch was a court-martial offense and ordered him to meet in the morning for further action. The next day, Firebrace appeared before Stephen and Weir, looking helpless. Weir was surprised to see him, but Stephen explained how Firebrace had slept on watch. Weir then told Stephen that Firebrace was their best tunneler and asked him what had happened. Firebrace explained that he had received a letter saying his son was suffering from diphtheria and his condition had worsened that week. His heart was back home, even though his body was on the front lines. Hearing this, Stephen was reminded of his own past of Isabel and the love he once had for her. But after a moment of reflection, he regained his composure and told Firebrace that when a soldier falls asleep on watch, hundreds of lives are put in danger, all of whom likely have families waiting for them back home too. Stephen then pulled out a deck of cards and asked Firebrace to tap the top card. When Firebrace did so, Stephen revealed it to be the ace, symbolizing power and stability. Taking it as a sign, Stephen decided to let Firebrace go, saying that the cards were in his favor. Later, Stephen's commanding officer ordered him to enter the tunnels in Amiens. Reluctant and unwilling to go, Stephen initially refused, but the officer was adamant. With no other choice, Stephen prepared to descend into the tunnels the next day. Firebrace, the most skilled tunneler, led the group and outlined the plan. He explained that they believed they had heard enemy activity ahead, and while Firebrace and his men would advance to investigate, Stephen and Weir were to cover them in case the enemy pushed through from the other side. Everyone agreed to the plan and began moving deeper into the tunnel. As the group advanced, one of the soldiers had a panic attack, protesting that he was infantry and not suited for tunnel warfare. Stephen, frustrated, pointed his gun at the soldier and warned him to keep moving, threatening that if he didn't, he'd be assigned to every patrol until he laid out wire from there to Switzerland. The soldier, terrified, reluctantly pushed forward, and Stephen followed closely behind. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Firebrace pressed his ear to the wall, listening intently for any signs of movement. Suddenly, he signaled for everyone to back up, sensing that the enemy was approaching. The group fell back and took defensive positions, bracing for an attack. Moments later, the enemy burst through the tunnel and a firefight broke out. In the chaos, Stephen was shot by one of the enemy soldiers. While the rest of the team managed to fend off the attackers, they quickly rushed Stephen to the medical area, hoping to save him. As the infection spread through Stephen's body, his health rapidly deteriorated. With resources scarce during the war, Stephen was deemed unfit for duty and transported to an area where he was left on the ground to die. Weir, heartbroken by the news of his friend's condition, struggled with the loss. Firebrace, upon hearing of Stephen's fate, decided to visit him and say a prayer for his soul. When Firebrace found Stephen, he was shocked to see him still alive, barely clinging to life. Instead of abandoning him, Firebrace took Stephen into his arms and carried him away to find treatment. After receiving medical care, Stephen's condition improved. His commanding officer informed him that they would be moving to Amiens the following week for another battle and offered Stephen the chance to return home for a desk job if he wished. However, Stephen, disillusioned by the war, believed it was not a conflict of honor, but a brutal experiment to see how far men could be degraded, with no limit to the horror and depravity. Despite his doubts, Stephen chose to return to the front lines. Rejoining the fight, he encountered both Weir and Firebrace. Grateful, Stephen thanked Firebrace for saving his life. That same night, Firebrace received a devastating letter. His son had passed away from diphtheria 2 weeks earlier, and he had only just learned of it. Overwhelmed with grief, Firebrace was heartbroken. Stephen, deeply sympathetic, approached him and apologized for his loss, offering his condolences. Later, while walking down a road, Stephen saw a woman who looked eerily similar to Isabel. He followed her, only to discover that it was Jeanne, Isabel's sister. To his surprise, he found himself standing right in front of René's house. Urging Jeanne to let him see Isabel, she reluctantly agreed. When Stephen entered the house, he was shocked to see Isabel, her face marred by a scar from a shell attack. Desperate for answers, Stephen asked why she had left him and returned to René. Isabel, unable to explain, simply said it had been a difficult decision. Frustrated, Stephen yelled, telling her that she was the only woman he had ever truly loved. Isabel remained silent, unable to reveal the reason. Stephen gently caressed her cheek, but Isabel called for Jean, signaling the end of their conversation. Heartbroken, Stephen left. Jean reassured him that Isabel still loved him, but there were things she couldn't share for his own protection. Later, Stephen was summoned to a Frontline headquarters meeting. The officers revealed a plan to lay mines under the German trenches at Beaumont-Hamel, with the goal of blowing up the ridge in a final attack. Stephen voiced concerns about the plan, noting the machine gun defenses and uncut wires, but the commanding officer dismissed his worries, insisting that the wires had been cut and orders must be followed. On the battlefield, Stephen soon realized his fears were justified. The wires hadn't been cut. Nevertheless, they were forced to push forward. Bombs exploded, killing many of Stephen's men, and a fierce battle with the Germans ensued. Injured and battered, Stephen barely survived and managed to return to the woods where his unit was stationed. Weir delivered the grim news that half of England's forces had been lost. 2 years later, Stephen met Jeanne at a cafe. He inquired about Isabel, only to learn that she had died, her weakened heart and lungs unable to recover from her injuries. The news devastated him. Jeanne then revealed something even more shocking. Isabel had a daughter, and the girl was Stephen's child. Isabel had left him because she believed he wasn't ready to become a father. Stephen was stunned as he met the girl, mesmerized by how much she resembled Isabel. Jean asked him to stay and be part of his daughter's life, but Stephen, overwhelmed by the revelation, couldn't accept the responsibility and chose to leave once again for the war. One night, while chatting with Weir, Stephen watched in horror as Weir stepped outside and was immediately shot in the head by an enemy sniper. Devastated by the loss of his friend, Stephen mourned him deeply. Later, Stephen and Firebrace led a team down into the tunnels to monitor enemy movements. A sudden explosion killed most of their men and left both Stephen and Firebrace seriously injured. Firebrace, unable to walk, was carried by Stephen through the tunnels. At that moment, Stephen realized the importance of family and the value of having a daughter. He was determined to survive and return to her. However, their escape route was blocked by debris from the explosions. While searching for a way out, Stephen found boxes of explosives. Firebrace advised him that a single box would be enough to blast an opening, but warned him to move the rest of the boxes down the tunnel first to avoid a deadly explosion. Stephen followed Firebrace's instructions. After completing the task, Stephen returned to find Firebrace mumbling his son's name before passing away. With a heavy heart, Stephen set off the explosion and created a way out of the tunnel. Emerging from the hole, Stephen was met by enemy soldiers. With no weapon, he prepared to fight, but the soldiers informed him that the war was over. Overcome with emotion, Stephen hugged the soldier and broke down in tears. After the war, Stephen returned to Jeanne's house, ready to spend the rest of his life with his daughter, finally embracing the family he had once been so reluctant to accept. And that's the powerful journey of love, loss, and survival in this mini-series called Birdsong. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more captivating tales. Your support keeps the magic alive.